Hi Team Luke! If you're curious about using blended food for your child's tube feeding, keep watching as I'll be running through some of the important information that you'll need to know in order to create nutritious blended meals. I'm Kariya, a registered dietitian and blended diet expert. I'm also a certified nutrition support clinician, and I've been working at a major hospital in Vancouver, Canada for over 15 years. I also conduct blenderized tube feeding research, and I'm the founder of naturaltubefeeding.com, a resource website with recipes, an online course, and really all the information that you'll need if you want to be blending meals for tube feeding. My tube feeding philosophy is that everybody deserves to have options. They deserve to be given a choice for what they want for their child's tube feeding, and their choices should be respected and supported by their healthcare team. In my opinion, whenever possible, fresh, wholesome food should be included in a person's diet, whether they eat by mouth or are tube fed. So what is blenderized tube feeding? Well, I like to define it as food and fluids blended together to create liquid meals for tube feeding. And it can be called other things. Blended diets is a very common term, but it can also be spelled blenderized tube feeding with a Z or an S, and sometimes we call it puree diet by feeding tube. Now, blended diets are not new. Blended food was used for tube feeding long before the invention of commercial tube feeding formulas. In fact, there are still many countries where formula is not an option or not available, so people continue to have no choice but to use blended food. An interest in blenderized tube feeding or blended diets is definitely increasing, and more people are choosing blended food instead of or as an adjunct to formula. Now, there are all kinds of reasons why people choose a blended diet. Oftentimes, it's because they're seeking a higher quality diet, or they might want to be sharing meals with their tube-fed loved one, and with blenderized tube feeding, you can do that. They may be seeking a sense of normalcy or wanting to include familiar foods in their diet. Blended tube feeding also allows for inclusion of cultural foods, and that can be extremely meaningful for many people. Often, people are finding that a blended diet is better tolerated. It also allows to limit certain foods that a person could be reacting to or have an allergy to. And there are definitely many people who choose a blended diet because they do not like the ingredients in standard tube feeding formula. So there are actually 3 options for tube feeding. You can use formula, or you can use a real food containing formula, or you can use blended food and fluids. But you can also use any combination of the 3. It's about finding what works best for your child. So you're probably wondering now if you should be making the choice to blend for your child. So it's very important that you understand the benefits and the potential risks or challenges of a blended diet and make an informed decision with your child's healthcare team. And in order to do that, you are going to need to weigh the risks versus the benefits. So I'm going to be going through the benefits and the potential risks in order to make sure that you know exactly what could arise if you are using a blended diet for your child. So a blended diet offers 6 key benefits, and the first one that I'll be going over is probably the most obvious, which is that having fresh, wholesome food in your child's diet really does provide them with a better quality diet compared to commercial tube feeding formula. That's because you can include fresh foods, you can choose foods that contain antioxidants and omega-3 fats, which are so important for brain health and healing. Those would be things like berries, spinach, fatty fish like even sardines or salmon, nuts and seeds like walnuts, flax seeds, things like avocado, for example. These would be providing healthy fats and lots of antioxidants to help with their brain recovery and healing. There's also natural fibers in blended food that can help with bowel health. And there's also the option to include probiotics, which provide healthy bacteria for their GI tract. I do also want to point out that homemade blended food is generally significantly lower in sugar than formula. In fact, there is a huge amount of sugar in standard tube feeding formula, and with a blended diet, you could potentially not add any simple sugars into your child's meals if that is something that is important to you. Those are really big considerations for many people, and if you really want to look at your child's tube feeding formula label, you might see that there are other ingredients that you might prefer not to include in your child's diet. And with a blended diet, you can include whatever you feel is best for your child into their diet as long as their nutrition needs are going to be met. Another benefit of blended diets, which have been consistently shown through research, is that blended food seems to be better tolerated than commercial tube feeding formula. So what tolerance means is essentially how a person feels when they're receiving their tube feeding and after their tube feeding. So we found that blended food makes people feel better during their meals and also after their meals. They tend to have less nausea, less vomiting. Kids experience less reflux. We also have seen improved bowel movements, particularly a decrease in diarrhea. And in my experience, I've also seen that with blended food, most people are able to tolerate higher infusion rates. So that could mean less time on a tube feeding pump and generally feeling better during tube feeding. There was a study out of Toronto, one of the major children's hospitals in Toronto, that looked at stool samples of tube-fed kids and compared those on a blended diet to those on commercial tube-feeding formula. And they found that the kids on a blended diet had a better bacterial profile in their GI tract. More good bacteria, less bad bacteria. We're not exactly sure how that implicates into general health, but it does seem to be an important element of health that we're still trying to understand. And what we do know is that more good bacteria has a good influence on health, and for that reason, a blended diet definitely has an advantage over tube feeding formula. Now, the fourth benefit I'd like to tell you about is related to tube weaning. So there have been studies that seem to have found that having a blended diet may help speed transitions from tube feeding to eating by mouth in children. And we're not sure why this is, but I suspect it could be that seeing blended food, smelling blended food, this all might generate an interest in food and eating that is to a greater extent than when a child is fed tube feeding formula. But this is a potential benefit and something to think about if your goal is to have your child get to eating by mouth. Benefit number 5 relates to positive experiences around meal times. So with blenderized tube feeding, you can share meals with tube-fed loved ones. You can also blend up your child's favorite foods. You can blend up cultural foods, and you can really make meal times a nurturing opportunity and feed your child foods and meals that you've prepared with love. And although that's a benefit that's hard to quantify, I think it's really worthwhile and meaningful to many people. Benefit number 6 is lower cost. Now, if you have insurance coverage for tube feeding formula, this might not be a factor, but there are places such as in my local area in Canada where people do not necessarily receive funding for their formula, and it can be extremely expensive to purchase. Making your own tube feeding formula can be much less expensive compared to buying tube feeding formula. Potentially a benefit if you are in a situation where you do not have insurance coverage for formula. So as you can see, blended diets do offer many benefits, but there are also potential risks, and I'm going to be reviewing those now. The first risk, and it's probably the most common risk, is nutritional inadequacy, which means that you're not necessarily going to provide your child with enough nutrition when you're blending meals compared to providing a prescribed amount of tube feeding formula. So what that could look like would be delayed growth, weight loss. It could mean nutritional deficiencies. It could be delayed healing and recovery. It could mean decrease in immune function if your child becomes malnourished. So these are serious consequences if your child isn't receiving enough nutrition. An example of that is a case of scurvy that was reported in a tube-fed child, where the parents were feeding their child just a blend of beef broth and cooked vegetables, and there was no vitamin C provided to the child in this diet. And for months, this was their diet, and they developed scurvy, which is a really rare vitamin C deficiency, which really is avoidable had they been providing their child with a balanced diet. So this was a situation that could have been avoided and unfortunately resulted in nutritional deficiency for this child. With blended diets, there's also an increased risk for bacterial contamination. So what that means is bacteria can grow in blended food that aren't properly prepared or stored. And then if you have spoiled blends, that can cause food poisoning if you feed it to your child. So it's really essential, if you're going to be using a blended diet, that you know how to safely prepare, store, and feed blends to minimize the risk of a foodborne illness. Another potential risk is infusion difficulty, and that's because pumps are designed for using formula, which is quite thin, it's smooth, there's no lumps or any food particles in formula. So many pumps are quite sensitive to blended food, and you might find that you have problems, especially if you're using a pump, with the pump alarming and not having the food flow easily. And this can be really frustrating. Another consideration is that there could be a risk for a blockage in the feeding tube, especially if your child has a small feeding tube, and I would define that as a feeding tube that's 12 French or smaller. If it's over 14 French, you probably don't have to worry too much. Now, the final risk I would like to mention is really not necessarily a risk, but it's something to consider. It's probably considered more accurately a downside of blended diets, and that is the inconvenience of preparing blended meals. This is going to require nutrition knowledge, meal planning, grocery shopping, cooking, blending, cleanup, which you don't have to do if you're using commercial tube feeding formula, so it is much more time consuming. It also is more difficult to use when on the go, in school, if you're out of the house. So these are important things to consider if you're deciding whether a blended diet is right for your child. So now you know the potential benefits and risks of a blended diet. But I do want you to remember that not everybody experiences the same benefits and not everybody experiences the same risks, and some of the risks can be mitigated. So it's really important that you weigh the benefits versus the risk for your child. I also want you to think about the importance of knowing how to safely plan and prepare blended meals, because that really is the key to everything in order to have a successful experience blending for your child. So now I'm going to go over some approaches that should help you make nutritious blended meals for your child. Keep in mind, this is just an overview. There's no way that I can get into all the necessary detail in a short presentation like this, but if you do want more information, I've got you covered with my online course and my recipe book over on my website, so check that out. Okay, so there are several different ways that you can create nutritious blended meals for your child, and I'll go over each one of these options now. So one of the simplest approaches is to just mimic a typical diet. So what I mean by that is that you would think about what would be an appropriate amount of food and type of food that you would feed a child of similar age. And then you just blend it up, and there's no calculations. It's very simple. It allows for individualization. So if you want to include more of protein, for example, into your child's diet, you can choose to do that. And it's really the easiest method, but it also does leave you with a lot of unknowns. You will not necessarily know how much nutrition your child is receiving. So let's look at some examples. So here is a blended French toast. So if a child would realistically have 2 pieces of French toast and 3 strawberries, what you would do is blend that up and give it through the feeding tube. Here's a blended peanut butter and jelly sandwich. Again, this could be a meal for a child or even for an adult, and it's providing protein and healthy fats and fiber, carbohydrates, and berries. Now here's a blended oatmeal, where what I've done is I've taken oatmeal, added some nut butter, some yogurt, some cinnamon and fruit, and blended that up for tube feeding. Another approach is called the plate proportion method, and that's where you would always just take the food that you want to blend and put it on a plate and look at it and make sure that there's a balance of protein, starch, and fat. And you'd want to use portions that would be appropriate if the child was able to eat by mouth. So some examples of that could be this taco here. It might seem odd to blend a taco, but when you think about it, it's a balanced meal and it follows that plate proportion concept. You've got the protein from the cheese and the beans, you've got fat from avocado and the sour cream, and you've got vegetables, you've got the carbohydrates from the wrap. So it actually is quite a complete meal. Another method is what I call the food group servings method, and this is where you would aim to include a certain number of servings from each food group into the daily blends. And the number of servings per food group is determined by your child's calorie goal, and you'll probably need some guidance from their healthcare team in regards to setting up that kind of a plan. You can also look at the USDA MyPlate to see kind of what I'm talking about. It shows for every calorie level what the number of food group servings you would need in order to meet those energy requirements. Another option is to use recipes, and this can really make life easy because if you're following trusted recipes such as the ones that I've developed in my recipe ebook, you're going to know that you're getting a nutritious recipe or blend every single time, and you can trust that it's going to be the right viscosity or thickness for tube feeding. So if that interests you to use recipes, I encourage you to use recipes from trusted sources, and certainly my recipe book is one of those, and you can find that on my website. Now, the really important considerations when making blended meals is nutritional adequacy. So in order to have a nutritionally adequate blend, you need to be focused on providing a balance of macronutrients, enough calories or energy, and all the necessary micronutrients. So it's a really important concept to have enough calorie density in your blends. And what I mean by that is getting plenty of calories within a reasonable volume. So I always give my patients and clients the goal of aiming for blends that contain at least 1 calorie for every milliliter of volume. So what I mean by that is a calorie-dense blend that has at least 1 calorie per milliliter means that in a 500 milliliter blend, there should be at least 500 calories. If you are making a blend that is 500 milliliters and it only contains 100 or 200 calories, this is a huge problem because you will need so much volume in order to meet your child's nutritional needs that it's probably not realistic for them to get it all in every day, and that's where you're going to fall into that trap of nutritionally inadequate blends. You also need to make sure that your child is getting enough protein, and in order to do that, you're going to need to know how much protein they need every day. And then you're going to probably want to include a protein source in every blended meal, because if you don't, then you're going to have an issue. Some people want to just do a protein meal in the evening, for example, but it's just impossible to give a day's worth of protein in a single blend. I like to give all my patients a gram goal, or my clients a gram goal, and that would be the amount of protein needed in each blended meal in order to meet daily protein needs. So for example, if your child needs 60 grams of protein and you're planning on giving them 3 meals every day, then each meal needs to have 20 grams of protein, and therefore that means your protein gram goal would be 20. And if every blend has about 20 grams of protein, then you're going to be just fine. Your child's going to meet their protein needs every single day. So you're probably wondering now, well, how am I going to know how much protein's in my blends or how many calories in my blends? Well, I encourage you to use a nutrition analysis app, and it could be you could also use a website. I really like the company Chronometer. In using this app, or you can go to the Chronometer website, you can determine how many calories, how many grams of protein are in your child's blends. You can also look at the micronutrients, the vitamins and minerals, for example. So this will be really helpful, especially when you're starting out, so you can have some confidence that your child's getting enough nutrition. So I've talked about how to get an idea of what to blend, but now I would like to talk about how to actually blend up food for tube feeding. So it's really simple. All you have to do is blend solid food with enough liquid to make a smooth fluid texture. You don't want to use excess fluid because that thins out your blend and drops the calorie density. The ideal consistency for tube feeding is a smooth fluid texture without any lumps. You want to make sure it's nice and smooth so that you don't have any issues with your feeding set, your pump, your feeding tube. You can use all kinds of different methods for administering tube feeding for blended food, such as a pump, syringe, or even gravity infusion. And generally, when you make a transition to a blended diet, you would just use the same method you were using before, and then seeing what other options may open up with a blended diet. We talked about earlier about the issue of potential foodborne illness, so it's really essential that you keep in mind good food safety practices. So that means preparing foods to the right temperatures, cooking any foods that need to be cooked to the right temperature to kill any potential bacteria. You also want to make sure you're storing foods properly in the refrigerator. I generally say, leftover blended foods, you can certainly store them for future use, but you want to use them within 2 days. Don't keep blends in your fridge for longer than 2 days. They can also be stored in the freezer for up to 2 months. There are some other considerations for blended meals, one of which is that you wouldn't want to blend anything that wouldn't be suitable to eat by mouth. So any cooking steps required for foods that you would eat by mouth, you definitely want to do. So that would mean peeling foods that need to be peeled if you're going to eat them by mouth, cooking any foods that need to be cooked before you would eat them by mouth. So don't put things like raw eggs in blends, for example. It's also important to know that blends should only be at room temperature for a maximum of 2 hours. This is because bacteria can grow if it's at room temperature for longer than that. So if you are doing pump administration overnight of blended food, it really isn't a good option unless you're going to be changing out the food every 2 hours. So I'd like you to keep in mind that a blended diet does not have to be perfect. You can take your time to learn and figure out what works best for you and your child. If you are looking for help, I would encourage you to visit my website. You can take a look at my recipe book where there's 20 different recipes, breakfast, lunch, dinners, and snacks, and they're all meant to be nutrient dense. They all are the perfect texture for tube feeding, and they're colorful and intended to be shared with loved ones who eat by mouth. I've also got the Natural Tube Feeding Blended Diet online course available, and that's where you're going to get the detailed information that you'll need in order to create your own blended meals. And as part of that course, not only do you get recipe templates and all kinds of resources to help support you with your blends, you also get access to me via the course Q&A emails, so you can submit your questions and I'll answer them. So at the beginning of this talk, I defined blenderized tube feeding as food and fluids blended together to create liquid meals for tube feeding. But really, a blended diet is so much more than that. It represents love, hope, normalcy, freedom, and comfort. And I'd like to finish by sharing this quote from the mother of a tube-fed child, where she said, "I am so grateful for the bridge that a real food diet creates in the normalcy of preparing and cooking and sharing." Thank you so much for your interest in using a blended diet for your child's tube feeding. If you want to reach out to me, you can do so by following me on social media or via my website, naturaltubefeeding.com. Thank you so much. Bye.